Thank you for choosing the 16 by 14 Timber Frame Pavilion from Yardistry. We are confident you'll find the assembly process straightforward as long as you work through each step in the assembly manual. In addition, this Helpful Hints video offers tips and tricks we've learned along the way for handling some of the more critical steps. Step 1. Inventory. Before beginning assembly, sort your inventory by laying out each of the wood parts and hardware on the ground. Then, using the stamps or marked reference numbers, take a few minutes to cross-reference each part with the list in the assembly manual. Remember, we're always here to help. Contact us if you find a part that is damaged or missing. Take a moment to record the carton ID stamp for each box that you receive. There is a space on page 13 of your instruction manual to write down the first 5 digits that come before 14459 and also the letter at the end. Post assemblies. Start by laying a post on a flat, solid, and raised surface. At the bottom of the post, place one post mount so the short side is to the inside wall of the post, then loosely attach with hex bolts. The hex bolts should connect with the T-nuts that were previously installed. Next, install 2 pan screws in the lower inside holes. It's okay if these go in on an angle. Then install 2 wood screws into the holes in the bottom of the post mount. Once the screws are all installed, make sure to tighten the hex bolts. Place a second post mount on the opposite side of the first one and repeat the process. Once the first 2 post mounts are installed, flip the post and repeat steps so that you have 4 post mounts. It's important to install the post mounts one at a time on opposite sides in order for them to fit correctly. Repeat for all 4 posts. Front-back beam assembly. To create your beam assemblies, start by laying an inner center beam on a flat raised surface with the laps facing down. Install the T-nuts, then flip the board over so the laps are facing up. Next, place an inner short beam on either side of the inner center beam, making sure the laps fit tightly together. Place 2 outer beam FBs on top of the assembly. The beams should meet in the middle, and the holes for the gussets should be aligned. Position a long beam insert on the outer beam FBs, making sure the holes are aligned correctly. If the holes for the gussets are at the top, you'll need to flip the insert over so the gusset holes are at the bottom and all the holes line up. To help ensure that all pieces are aligned correctly, insert long bolts into the 4 center holes and the gusset holes. Have someone look down the beam to make sure it's aligned, and once everything is properly lined up, install the hex bolts and remove the long bolts from the assembly. Side beam assembly. Start your side beam assembly on a flat raised surface. Position a beam bottom center so that the laps are facing down and the beam bottom ends are in place. Then install the T-nuts. Next, flip the assembly over and install the hex bolts. When assembling the beam top LT and beam top RT, you'll want to make sure that the groove is facing up and the laps are facing down on both boards. Install the T-nuts. Flip the assembly over and attach with hex bolts. Next, install T-nuts into the back beam center, leaving these 2 center holes empty. Flip the board so the laps are facing up and put the beam back end in place on each end, taking care that the laps are tight. Place 2 beam block 9 inches, 2 beam block 17 inches, and 1 beam block 24 inches on the assembly. It's important to check that the blocks are positioned correctly and that the measurements between blocks is correct. Once all of the blocks are in place, lay 2 beam fronts on top with the laps tight together. Center a side beam insert on the beam fronts so that the bolt holes line up. At this point, insert 3 long hex bolts into the holes on each end of the assembly and another 2 bolts through the center holes in the insert. These bolts are temporary and are only used here to hold the assembly in place. Use hex bolts to fasten all pieces of the assembly together. making sure to leave the temporary bolts in place for the time being. You'll notice that the beam blocks are more narrow than the top and bottom boards. With a helper, flip the assembly so the bolt heads are facing the outside. Then place the beam top assembly so that the groove sits tight and is flush to each end. If you notice the beam top does not fit tightly to the grooves, try the following steps. If the beams are pulled in too tightly, simply loosen these hex bolts until the beam top fits into place. If you notice the blocks are sitting too high, loosen the bolts and make the necessary adjustments until the beam top assembly fits correctly. Once the beam top assembly is in place, attach with wood screws. The long hex bolts should be able to move freely in the holes. If they don't, simply loosen the screws slightly until they move freely. Next, be careful not to let the bolts fall out. Flip the assembly so the beam insert is facing outwards. Place the beam bottom on the assembly so the groove sits tight. Then attach with wood screws. If it's not fitting correctly, the same tips apply that we used for the beam top assembly. Check to make sure long bolts can move freely, then tighten the hex bolts. Now is the time to remove the long bolts from the assembly and to install the lag bolt in the center hole. Frame assembly. On a solid raised surface, lay 2 post assemblies down so that the notches are facing upwards. Then place the side beam assembly so that it sits on the notches of the post. The beam insert should be facing the outside. Check to make sure that the side beam is flush to the top and to the outside edges of the posts, and make sure the top beam assembly is towards the top of the side beam assembly. Then attach with hex bolts. Repeat to make a second post beam assembly. Before installing the gussets, it's important to make sure your assembly is square. Once this is done, have a helper hold the gusset in place. It should be centered on the beam assembly. Attach with wood screws and then install the lag screws. Repeat to install the remaining gussets. For the next part of the assembly, you will need 5 people and 3 ladders. Move the assemblies to the final location. It's important that the ground is level and flat. With helpers, carefully stand the assemblies up, making sure that there are helpers holding each side of the assembly in place. Have 3 people bring in a front beam assembly. The long beam insert should be facing the outside of the assembly, and the gusset holes should be towards the bottom. When installing the hex bolts, note that the 2 holes on the end of the beam are left open. These holes will be used later in the assembly. Once both front assemblies are installed, the unit will need to be squared. You can refer to page 27 of your instruction manual for measurements. To install gussets on the front beam assembly, have a helper hold the gusset in place, then install hex bolts and lag screws. When installing the lag screws, it's important to make sure that the holes are pre-drilled. Install the remaining gussets in the same manner, and then check to make sure all areas are square. Truss assemblies. Build your truss assemblies on a flat raised surface. Before installing the bolts, check that all truss pieces are in the correct orientation. The flange on the horizontal truss should be towards the bottom, and the flanges on the truss tie centers should be facing inwards. Once everything is in place, attach with hex bolts. To install the center truss assembly on the unit, you will need 3 people and 3 ladders. To make the assembly easier, you can have the bolts already in the beams. Have 1 person in the center holding the truss assembly in place, and 2 people on either end of the truss attaching the bolts. Upright assembly. Installing the upright assemblies will require 2 people and 2 ladders. Install T-nuts in the upright back. Have 1 person hold the front upright against the beam from outside of the assembly and insert the hex bolts. From inside the assembly, have a second person bring in the upright back, lining the holes up with the hex bolts. Check that the sides, bottom, and top are flush. Then tighten the hex bolts from the outside and install wood screws from the inside. Roof panel assembly. On a flat raised surface, place 5 common rafters so the grooves are facing down. For this video, we will be building a left panel assembly. Since we are building the left panel, the center rafter will go to the far left of the common rafters. For the right panel assembly, the center rafters would go to the far right. You'll be able to tell the difference in the rafters by the number of holes. The common rafters have 1 hole, and the center rafters will have 4. With a helper, place a bottom rafter on the bottom end of the assembly. It's important to make sure that the edge of the bottom rafter is flush to the bottom of all the other rafters, and that the larger angle is on the same side as the grooves. Wood screws will be installed on an angle. When installing the top rafter, you'll need to make sure it's positioned correctly. When it's in the correct position, the holes should be towards the bottom, and there should not be any gap between the boards. Once the top rafter is installed, flip the panel assembly over so the grooves are facing up. To verify that the bottom panel was installed correctly, place a level on the common rafter and the bottom rafter. If there is a gap, remove the screws and flip the board over. When it's flush, reinsert the screws. Both the top and bottom rafters should be flush without any gap. Place 3 straps so they fit into the grooves in the rafters. Before attaching the straps, it's important to make sure that the roof panel is square. For measurements, refer to page 36 of your instruction manual. Once the assembly is square, check that the end of the straps are flush to the outside edge of the panel. Then attach with wood screws. Next, attach a rafter bracket long to each of the middle 4 common rafters, making sure that they are positioned as shown on page 36 of your instruction manual. The next part of the assembly is required for 1 left panel with brackets and 1 right panel with brackets only. With a helper, flip the panel assembly over so that the straps are towards the bottom. At each end of the assembly, place a ridge short on the top rafter and use a long hex bolt to line up the holes. The ridge shorts should be flush to the side of the top rafter. Place 2 ridge longs in the center openings, again, using long bolts to align the holes. Once they are in place, attach the ridge shorts and ridge longs with wood screws and remove the long bolts. Attaching roof panels. Gloves are essential for this part of the assembly because roofing materials can have sharp edges. To prevent scuffing, remove the clear and blue protective film from both sides of each aluminum part just before you use it. If you're using a power tool, take care not to over tighten the roofing screws, as that can damage the roof panels. We recommend hand tightening the roofing screws until they are snug. Start by making sure your roof panel frame assembly is positioned with the straps facing up. With a helper, lay the first aluminum panel down so that it's flush at the top and the sides. There should be a slight overhang at the bottom of the panel. Lay the second panel down so that 1 rib is overlapping the first panel. Again, making sure that the top and sides are flush and that there is an overhang at the bottom. If the panels are overhanging on the top or the sides, check to make sure the roof panel frame is square. Once the roof panels are properly in place, attach with roofing screws. Be careful not to over tighten. The bottom row should be left empty at this point. These holes will be used in a later step. Repeat steps to attach all remaining roof panels. Next, place a roof edge along the bottom of a roof panel assembly so that the holes line up with the roof panel. Be sure to pre-drill the 2 end holes and then attach with roofing screws taking care not to over-tighten. Then install the remaining roofing screws. Repeat for the rest of the roof panel assemblies. Peel away a small portion of the backing on a strip of weather seal. Then begin attaching it to the rounded bottom of a ridge clip. Ridge clips are installed only onto the center rafters. You can easily identify the center rafters by locating the 4 holes in the board. Measure 2 3/4 inches up from the bottom of the rafter and make a mark. Place the ridge clip so that it's flush to both ends and so that the bottom of the ridge clips align with the mark. Take care not to push down on the ridge clip. Attach with screws, then repeat for the remaining roof panel assemblies. Attach roof panels to frame. Do not attempt this part of the assembly in windy conditions. You'll need 4 people and 3 ladders for this part of the assembly. Assign 1 person to remain in the middle throughout the roof assembly to support the roof panels. Ladder placement is important for this step. We recommend having 1 ladder in the middle on one side of the truss, 1 ladder on the inside of the beam, and 1 ladder outside of the assembly. Have 2 people lift a right roof panel assembly with roof ridges up and onto the frame, making sure that the center rafter is not facing the front of the unit. It's important that the panel is orientated correctly and that the brackets are lifted up and over the beam to avoid any scratches or damage. The gable and truss assemblies can be used to support the roof panel and hold it in place. Check to make sure that the corner of the roof panel is sitting flush to the beam and that notches in the rafter are tight to the side beam. Bring a left panel assembly without roof ridges in and onto the frame in the same manner. Then loosely attach the panels together with hardware. Note that the center rafters in both panels are towards the middle of the unit. Bring in the left roof panel with roof ridges and lift it up over the beam, taking care not to damage or scratch it. Place the panel next to the right roof panel that was installed previously. The center rafters should meet. Make sure the cutout is tight to the side beam on the back of the unit. Then loosely attach the center rafters to each panel. Next, attach a center rafter bracket to the center rafter where the roof panels meet. It's best to have 1 person attaching the bracket from the inside of the assembly, while a second person outside of the assembly checks to make sure that the center rafters are flush at the bottom. The roof panels can also be pushed upwards in the center to help align the holes in the rafters and the brackets. To install the peak cap once it's assembled, have 3 helpers and 3 ladders ready. Have 1 person bring the peak cap in upside down and pass it to the person in the middle. The peak cap can then be lifted up and guided to a person positioned at the front of the unit. Once the peak cap is all the way across, flip it over so that the peak post long fits into the spaces in the roof ridges. At this point, loosely attach the peak bracket and peak loop as shown on page 52 of your instruction manual. To make it easier to install the peak loop, place a piece of tape over the nut. That way it doesn't fall out during installation. Now is the time to bring in the final roof panel. We recommend having an extra ladder in the center, as additional help may be needed to get the panel properly in place. Make sure the panel is in the correct position. 1 person on the center ladder will need to push up on the peak cap so the roof panel can slide underneath, while the second person guides the panel into position. Check to make sure the cutout in the roof panel is tight and flush to the side beam. Loosely attach the center rafters together and install the center beam bracket. As with the other panels, the roof may need to be pushed upwards in the center to help align the holes. Before attaching the long rafter brackets, Check to ensure that the cutouts in the rafters are tight to the beam. If they aren't, try adjusting the panels slightly by pushing up on them from the inside and pushing down from the outside of the roof panel. If the brackets still aren't snug to the beam, have two people push up on the roof panels from the inside. When brackets are properly in place, attach with pan screws. Once all of the brackets are installed, tighten all bolts in the roof assembly. When installing the ridge caps, slide them over the ridge clips from the bottom of the assembly and up towards the top. It's helpful to have a person pushing up on the P-cap from inside the unit to allow the ridge caps to slide underneath. If the ridge cap doesn't slide on smoothly, add a few drops of liquid soap on the inside of the cap before reinstalling. If the ridge cap still won't go on, or an obstacle is blocking it, try bending the ridge cap up on one side. Hook one side of the ridge cap over the bent side, then push down on the other side until it catches. Slide the ridge cap on and have someone push up on the P-cap long, so the ridge cap can slide underneath it. Then push down to bend the ridge clip back into place. Now is the time to go back and tighten the peak loop. Once the peak loop is secured, attach the truss tie mount to the rafter tops. If the truss is not quite reaching the roof panels, have a helper push up from the bottom until they meet. Install fascia. The fascia should be assembled on a solid, flat, and raised surface. To install the fascia assembly on the unit, we recommend 3 people and 3 ladders. Place a ladder on each side of the assembly and the third ladder in the middle. Carefully lift the fascia assembly into position and attach.